I found what he'd been hiding for 11 months on a Tuesday morning, while he was in the shower singing an old Tom Petty song like a man without a single thing to worry about. The number was $4,200, deposited every month, into an account I didn't know existed, attached to a debit card I'd never seen, under a name that was technically his but had never once appeared on anything we shared. 11 months. That was how long Daniel had been running a parallel financial life while I balanced our joint account to the penny and wondered why we always felt so tight. But here's the thing he never counted on: when he sat me down that same evening and announced, with this practiced, almost rehearsed calm, that from that month on, we'd be splitting the budget 50-50, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I said, fine. And I meant it in a way he couldn't possibly have understood yet. Daniel and I had been married for 6 years when all of this started unraveling, though I'd later understand the unraveling had begun much earlier than I'd noticed. We'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue in Asheville, the kind of late summer afternoon where the light comes in at a low angle and everything looks warmer and more golden than it actually is. He was standing near the coolers, talking about some hiking trail he'd done in Vermont, and I remember thinking he had the most deliberate way of listening. He didn't just nod, he turned toward you slightly, leaned in, made you feel like what you were saying was the only conversation happening in a yard full of people. I was 28, 2 years out of a relationship that had left me cautious and quietly exhausted, and Daniel felt like a warm hand reaching through a window I'd half forgotten I'd closed. We dated for 2 years, got engaged on a trip to the coast, and married in a small ceremony at his parents' lake house in North Carolina. His mother, Renee, cried the kind of tears that looked genuine from a distance, and I remember thinking at the time that it was one of the loveliest things I'd ever seen a person do. Our life together had a pleasant, unhurried rhythm in those first years, the kind of rhythm that you only recognize as precious in retrospect, once something has disrupted it so completely that you can't remember what the music sounded like. We both worked. I was a senior content strategist at a mid-size marketing firm. Daniel was in commercial real estate, which sounds more glamorous than it actually is. He spent most of his days driving between strip malls and talking on the phone with developers who never called back when they said they would. We rented a house in the Dilworth neighborhood for the first 2 years, easy and uncomplicated in the way that renting is before you start imagining permanence, and then bought our place on Selwyn just before our 3rd anniversary. It was a 1940s craftsman bungalow with a wide front porch, original hardwood floors that creaked in the same places every single time, and a kitchen that was too small but had windows that caught the afternoon light in a way that made cooking feel less like a chore and more like something worth doing slowly. I loved that kitchen with the specific, rooted love that you feel for spaces that have witnessed your ordinary life, the Sunday mornings with coffee and newspapers spread across the counter, the dinners that went long because the conversation did, the particular quality of silence in a house that belongs to you. Our finances had always been combined, and that had been something we'd agreed on deliberately. Before we even bought the house, it made sense, we said, it was simpler, it was how our parents had done it, it was a vote of confidence in the permanence of what we were building. We had one joint checking account, one joint savings, shared credit cards, shared everything. Every month I did what I privately called the Sunday sit-down. I'd open my laptop at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, pull up the accounts, and go through everything line by line with the careful attention of someone who genuinely wanted the numbers to be right. It was deeply unglamorous, slightly tedious, and I never missed a month. I knew our numbers the way some people know their commute, automatically, without having to think about it, the information just there when you reached for it. We had a mortgage payment, 2 car notes, utilities, groceries, Daniel's student loans, subscriptions we kept meaning to audit, and whatever we were saving toward the renovation of the upstairs bathroom that had been happening soon for approximately 4 years and showed no signs of actually happening. I tracked all of it, and Daniel was aware that I tracked it, and his awareness of this fact was expressed through a breezy, grateful detachment that I read at the time as a division of labor. He'd sometimes glance over my shoulder during the Sunday sit-down and say something like, "Looks good, right?" And I'd say yes, or I'd say we need to cut back on eating out, and he'd agree easily, immediately, without any friction, and that would be the extent of his involvement. Looking back now, I can see that I should have found that strange, not alarming, necessarily, but worth examining, worth at least one direct question. A grown man with a six-figure income who never once looked at his own bank account, who handed the entire management of the household finances to me with this breezy, grateful detachment, who agreed instantly with every financial observation I made and never once pushed back or contributed an opinion of his own, that's not a sign of trust. That's a sign of someone who needs you not to look too closely at certain things, who benefits from your careful management of the surface while something else runs underneath it. But at the time I read it as partnership, as complementary strengths, as the natural sorting that happens when two people share a life long enough to figure out who's good at what. There were small things, early on, that I catalogued without meaning to, little data points that I filed away under probably nothing without ever going back to open the file, the way you might notice sound in the wall of an old house and tell yourself it's just settling. The first one was maybe 4 years into the marriage, at a dinner with his colleague Seth and Seth's girlfriend at the time, a tall, pleasant woman named Carla whose laugh I liked. Daniel had a glass of wine more than usual that night and started talking about some investment opportunity, a storage unit facility out near Gastonia that a guy from his office was developing, something about the return projections and the location demographics and how the whole sector was undervalued. He was animated about it in a way that reminded me of early date Daniel, that leaning in quality turned toward an idea instead of a person. I asked a few questions. How much would we be talking about? What's the return timeline? Have you looked at the developer's track record? And something shifted in his face, quickly, like a door being closed before you can see what's behind it. Not dramatically, just a flicker, fast enough that you could decide you imagined it. He said, "I'm just telling you about it, not proposing we do it," and changed the subject with a fluency that suggested he'd had some practice at that particular maneuver. At the time I thought, he got embarrassed because I poked holes in the idea in front of his colleague. I filed it under ego, handled and moved on. The second thing was a phone call I overheard about a year later, and this one I remember with a precision that tells me some part of me understood, even then, that it mattered. I was carrying laundry down the hall and the bathroom door was slightly open and Daniel was in there talking, his voice low and quick in a way that wasn't his usual speaking voice, not quieter exactly, but compressed, the way your voice gets when you're covering distance and time at the same time. I only caught pieces, not yet, and she doesn't know, and give me a couple more weeks. I stood in the hallway for exactly 3 seconds. I know it was 3 because I counted them unconsciously, the way your body does when it's deciding something your brain hasn't caught up to yet, and then I kept walking. I told myself it was about a surprise, because his mother's birthday was coming up, because maybe it was a work thing he couldn't discuss yet, because there were 100 innocent explanations and only one that wasn't innocent. I put the laundry in the dryer and went back to whatever I'd been doing and I never asked him about it. That's the one I came back to later, again and again, pressing on it like a bruise that keeps surprising you with how deep it goes. By the 5th year of our marriage, Daniel had started spending more time at the office, and this was not immediately alarming because his business had genuinely picked up around that time. He'd landed a couple of bigger clients and was managing a commercial development project that seemed to operate on the kind of schedule that doesn't respect evenings or weekends. He'd text when he was running late, always, which I'd taken as consideration. He'd come home smelling like takeout and the particular stale air of conference rooms, and he'd be tired in the way that people are when their work actually demands something of them, not dramatically tired, not performatively tired, just ordinarily depleted in a way that I recognized and didn't question. I still made dinner most nights. I still did the Sunday sit down. I still felt, fundamentally, like we were in the same story, heading in the same direction, even if the chapter we were in had gotten a little quieter, a little more routine, a little less like the early years when everything still felt like it was being chosen rather than simply maintained. But somewhere in that 5th year, a low-grade unease settled into the house like weather you can't quite name, the kind of atmospheric shift that you notice first in your body before you can articulate it with your mind. It wasn't fights, we weren't fighting any more than before, and we'd never been fighters, which I'd always counted as one of our strengths and now sometimes wonder about differently. It wasn't coldness exactly, nothing you could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." It was more like a slight adjustment in his frequency, the The way a radio signal drifts by a fraction and you can still hear the music but something about it sounds faintly wrong, and you keep reaching for the dial without being able to say exactly what you're adjusting toward. He started closing his laptop more quickly when I came into a room, not slamming it, nothing dramatic, just clicking it shut with a casualness that was slightly too practiced, too smooth, the gesture of someone who'd been doing it long enough that it had stopped feeling like an act. I noticed it. I noted it. I did not say anything about it because I had trained myself, over years, to be the kind of wife who didn't manufacture problems where there weren't any, who was fair, who gave the benefit of the doubt, who trusted the person she'd chosen to build something with. That October, I asked him point blank if anything was bothering him, and I remember choosing the moment carefully. We were washing up after dinner, the ordinary choreography of it, him rinsing and me loading the dishwasher, the radio playing something low in the background, the kitchen comfortable in its usual evening way. I just asked, "Is something going on? You've seemed a little distant." He turned toward me with that listening lean thing, that quality of full attention that had made me fall for him to begin with, and said, "No, why? Should something be bothering me?" with a slight smile that was warm and slightly rueful at once. I said I didn't know, I just felt like he'd been somewhere else lately, harder to reach. He dried his hands on the kitchen towel, came over, put his arms around me from behind while I stacked plates, said, "You worry too much, you know that?" Then he kissed the side of my head and went to watch something in the living room, and I stood there with a dinner plate in my hands and thought, "See, you were building something out of nothing again, this is what you do, this is the thing about you that makes things harder than they need to be." The unease didn't go away. It just moved a little deeper, settled lower, became part of the background in a way that made it harder to locate but didn't make it disappear. The Sunday sit-down in January, 8 months before everything broke open, was the first time I noticed an actual discrepancy in the numbers, and even then, even with it right in front of me, I almost let it go. Daniel's bi-weekly paycheck was $500 less than it should have been based on the pay stubs we kept on our shared drive. Not missing from the joint account, exactly, the money had come in, it had deposited. But the stub said one number and the bank reflected a different number, and the difference was $500, clean and round and sitting there like a question I didn't quite want to ask. I told myself it was a payroll error, these things happened, everyone knew they happened, there was almost certainly a reasonable explanation that didn't require me to go looking for unreasonable ones. I made a note to ask Daniel about it, and then I didn't ask him, and then I forgot about the note, and then February came and the same thing happened again, same discrepancy, same clean round number, $500 going somewhere that wasn't our joint account, quiet and consistent as a heartbeat. That was when I should have walked through the door. Instead I stood in its frame for another month and a half, telling myself there was a rational explanation, while the rational part of me had already begun to understand there wasn't. I'd started keeping a separate record by March, just a small spreadsheet, saved on my personal laptop and not the shared drive, something I told myself was probably paranoid and did anyway because some part of me had decided that the habit of fairness and trust that had carried me through 6 years of marriage was beginning to feel less like a virtue and more like a strategic vulnerability someone had identified and was using. I tracked deposit amounts against pay stubs, month by month, bi-weekly, everything I could access. The $500 pattern held through February, March, and April with the regularity of something automated, something set up once and then left to run without further attention. Then in May it jumped, not $500 anymore, but $1,000 per pay period, extracted silently and deposited somewhere I couldn't see, while I went on doing the Sunday sit-down and managing the joint accounts and telling myself we were fine. Every 2 weeks, $1,000. Every 2 weeks, a life I didn't know about getting a little bit more funded. I remember closing the laptop after seeing that first $1,000 discrepancy and just sitting at the kitchen table for a long time, not moving, not making any sound, the refrigerator humming behind me in its ordinary way and outside the window a neighbor running a lawnmower 2 houses down. That summer afternoon sound that usually feels so pleasantly suburban and ordinary, and that afternoon felt like something being drawn deliberately across a nerve. I thought about all the times I'd said we're fine when someone asked how we were doing financially, the automatic confidence of a person who managed the numbers and therefore believed she knew them. I thought about the grocery spending I'd trimmed, the subscriptions I'd cancelled, the way I'd said no to Portugal for our 5th anniversary because I'd done the math and said we couldn't swing it right now, let's do it next year. We hadn't done it next year either. I let myself sit with the full weight of that for the duration of the lawnmower running, and then I made a decision. I was going to find out what was happening before I said a single word to Daniel. Not a question, not a hint, not a glance that lasted a second too long. Nothing that would tell him I was looking. I pulled out my phone and called Greta, who worked in corporate accounting and had over the years occasionally helped me understand things like depreciation schedules and deferred compensation packages, things that came up in my marketing work often enough that the calls were unremarkable. I didn't tell her what was actually happening. I wasn't ready to say the words out loud yet, wasn't sure what saying them out loud would make real, but I asked, theoretically, how a person might divert a portion of their paycheck to a secondary account without it showing clearly on their stub. Greta said, after a brief pause that might have meant something or might have just been Greta thinking, the most common way is through a direct deposit split. You set up your payroll to automatically send a fixed amount to a secondary account every pay period. The stub usually still shows the gross, but if someone's only monitoring deposits to one account, they could miss it for a long time. She paused again. What are you working on? I said it was for a piece we were developing for a financial services client, and she accepted that, and we talked for another 10 minutes about completely unrelated things, and when I hung up, everything I'd been trying not to think had arrived in the kitchen all at once, pulling up chairs, settling in, making itself comfortable in the way that truths do once they've decided you're ready for them. He had set up a direct deposit split. Which meant it wasn't a payroll error and it wasn't an administrative glitch and there was no innocent explanation I'd somehow failed to consider. It was a deliberate, ongoing, automated redirection of household income to an account I didn't know existed, set up once with intention and maintained for, based on what my spreadsheet showed, at least 11 months, probably longer. 11 months of money flowing sideways while I managed the accounts with my characteristic thoroughness and worried about the grocery budget and said no to the Portugal trip. 11 months felt, as a number, less like a mistake and more like a project. Less like a lapse and more like a plan executed with patience. And I still didn't know what the money was for, which meant that the worst of what I was imagining might be accurate, or it might be only the beginning of something worse still. And then came the Tuesday morning that changed everything, the one I've replayed so many times that the details of it are worn smooth as river stones, permanent and precise. Daniel was in the shower, I could hear the water and, underneath it, Tom Petty's Free Fallin' rendered in his tuneless but enthusiastic version, the voice of a man with nothing pressing on his conscience. I was at my laptop at the kitchen table, working through emails before a 9 o'clock call, the ordinary beginning of an ordinary day. His phone was on the counter, charging, face up, which was unusual. He typically kept it face down, a habit I'd noticed without remarking on it. It buzzed with a notification and I glanced over, the reflex of proximity rather than intention, the way you look at movement in your peripheral vision without deciding to. The screen showed a banking app notification from a bank we didn't use together. The notification showed a balance update. The number on the screen was $47,280. My 9 o'clock call was entirely lost to me at that moment, just gone, as though it had never been scheduled, as though work were a thing that happened to other people in a different dimension. I put my coffee cup down with a precision that came from somewhere automatic in my nervous system, the part that keeps operating when the conscious mind has temporarily gone very quiet. I walked to the counter. I picked up his phone. I don't have a clean explanation for what I did next except that 11 months of careful discrepancies had stripped away whatever hesitation might otherwise have stopped me, the consideration, the fairness, the benefit of the doubt, and what was left underneath all of that was something more elemental and clear-eyed that simply needed to know. The screen was still lit. I pressed it open. The banking app notification opened directly into the account summary, and I stood at my kitchen counter and read it in the same kitchen where I'd been doing the Sunday sit-down for 6 years. The account was in his name only, opened 22 months ago, not 11, not the timeline I'd been tracking, but 22 months, nearly 2 years before I'd caught the first discrepancy, which meant he'd been running this for 2 full years before I'd noticed a single thing wrong. The current balance was $47,280. There were regular deposits, some from the payroll split I'd been tracking, some that looked like transfers from a third account I didn't recognize, and some with memo field notations I couldn't decode from a quick scan. There were withdrawals too: restaurants, a hotel in Charleston I had never been to, a jewelry store on Park Road 2 blocks from my office whose name I knew from passing it twice a week, and a recurring monthly payment to something called Summit Grove Properties LLC. The shower was still running. Tom Petty was still going. I photographed every screen I could navigate to, the balance, the full transaction history, the account details, everything, and then I put the phone back exactly where it had been, face up on the counter, precisely the same angle, and I went back to my chair. I picked up my coffee cup. My hands were perfectly steady in the specific way that hands are steady when your body has decided there's no energy to spare for trembling, when everything available is being routed somewhere else. My mouth tasted of copper and cold coffee and something underneath both of those that I can only describe as the particular flavor of a world that has reorganized itself without your consent. He came downstairs 20 minutes later, showered and dressed and entirely himself, the gray blazer he wore on days he had client meetings, the good shoes, the way he always touched the kitchen counter with one hand as he rounded the corner, a habit so specific and consistent that I'd always found it endearing. He poured coffee, glanced at his phone with a small private smile at whatever he saw there, set it back down. He asked me how my morning was going, the ordinary question of an ordinary Tuesday, and I said fine. The word sat in the air between us and he had no idea what it was carrying. He left for work at 8:45 and I watched his car back out of the driveway and disappear, and then I got up and went to my home office and started pulling the thread as hard and as fast as I could. That afternoon I called the number listed for Summit Grove Properties LLC, and I told the woman who answered that I was calling on behalf of my financial advisor to verify information about a property account. She asked for the account holder's name. I gave Daniel's. She confirmed the account was active and in good standing, and when I asked what type of property was associated with the account she said she wasn't able to share details without authorization from the account holder, and I thanked her and hung up because I already had what I needed. Property. A real estate investment account funded with money from our marriage that I hadn't known existed until 45 minutes ago. I drove to the county recorder's office the next morning under the pretense of a dentist appointment, sat with a clerk named Becky for 45 minutes, and walked out with a copy of a deed filed 14 months ago for a single-family residential property in Plaza Midwood, 4 miles from our house, listing Summit Grove Properties LLC as the purchaser, Daniel W. Alcott as the LLC's principal officer, and an address that was a P.O. box in Charlotte. Purchase price, $310,000. No co-borrower. No mention of a spouse. No mention of me, the person whose carefully managed budget had been sending money toward this every 2 weeks for nearly 2 years. I sat in my car in the recorder's office parking lot for 22 minutes with the dashboard clock ticking through each one, holding a parking validation stub I'd forgotten to use, staring at nothing while everything rearranged itself into its true and final shape. He had bought a house 4 miles away. Through an LLC he'd created. With money from our marriage. The question that arrived in my mind fully formed, not with drama but with the flat, clean clarity of something inevitable, was not what is the house for. I already had feelings about that question that I wasn't ready to process directly yet. The question was, what is he about to do? Because you don't build something this carefully for 2 years without an endgame. And whatever the endgame was, I was almost certainly cast in a role that had been written without my input. The answer came that same evening, faster than I'd expected, with flowers. Daniel came home at 6:30, earlier than usual, carrying grocery store mixed flowers, the kind men buy when they're setting a pleasant atmospheric stage for a conversation they've already rehearsed. He put them in my counter vase, poured 2 glasses of wine, asked how my day was with attentive eyes, and I took my glass and sat at the kitchen table and watched him arrange himself across from me with the particular quality of focused attention that I now understood as performance, as preparation, as a man positioning himself for an important scene. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at me with that measured, reasonable expression that had, over the years, made me feel heard and considered and now made the back of my neck prickle with something that wasn't quite cold and wasn't quite hot. "I've been thinking about something," he said, in the tone of a person presenting a considered idea after careful reflection, "and I want to talk to you about it." "Okay," I said. "I think we've been handling finances in a way that doesn't really make sense long term," he said, studying the table for a moment before looking back up at me. "We're both earning. We're both adults. I think it would be healthier, more equitable, honestly, if we each maintained our own finances and just split shared expenses 50-50. He picked up his wine glass, held it loosely. "Mortgage, utilities, groceries, we calculate the total, split it down the middle, each pay our half. Everything else is ours individually. I think it's actually a more modern way to do it. Less entanglement." The word entanglement landed somewhere in my sternum and radiated outward, and I looked at this man I'd married in front of his crying mother and thought, there it is. The setup. The opening move of whatever he's been building toward. He was proposing to disentangle our finances officially, cleanly, under the guise of modern equity, which would allow him to continue moving money however he liked without any risk of discovery, and which would establish a new baseline of financial separateness that would make a future separation look like a natural evolution rather than an ambush. He'd done the groundwork. He was now opening the curtain. And he was looking at me across the kitchen table we'd shared for 4 years, in the house we'd bought together, with a face of practiced reasonableness, and waiting to see what the wife he thought he had was going to say. "Fine," I said. His eyebrows went up, just a fraction, an involuntary movement that he smoothed back down quickly. He'd expected pushback, the flowers, the wine, the careful word choices all telegraphed that he'd been prepared for a negotiation, had planned for resistance, had a second and possibly a third argument ready. And I'd given him nothing to push against. "Fine," he repeated. "Fine," I said again, with the same flat steadiness. "If you think that's the better approach, let's do it." Something settled in his posture then, a loosening, a release of held tension, and he said, "Good. I think this is going to be better for both of us. We can work out the logistics over the next couple weeks, whatever makes sense." He sounded genuinely relieved, the specific relief of a man who'd been braced for a hard conversation and found it easy, and I watched that relief move across his face and I kept my own face completely still and gave him nothing at all. We made dinner. We ate it. We talked about other things. He cleaned up. We watched something on television and he fell asleep on the couch with his hand on the remote and his mouth slightly open, and I sat beside him and stared at the television screen and let the full architecture of what I was going to do assemble itself in my mind, piece by careful piece. That night I lay awake beside him in the dark and did something I'd never allowed myself to do in 6 years of marriage. I thought about him with complete clarity, stripping away everything I'd wanted to see and looking only at what was actually there. He was a man who had spent nearly 2 years quietly and methodically preparing to exit a marriage, or to engineer the conditions that would make me leave, while continuing to share a bed and a table and a life with me, while performing partnership so convincingly that I'd had to work to find the seams. He had built his exit with the same patient, deliberate attention that he brought to everything he did well, and he'd done it while I stood there being a faithful, organized, trusting wife who managed the finances and worried about the grocery budget and told people we were fine. The rage that moved through me in those dark hours wasn't hot, it had already moved past hot, past the stage where it shakes your hands and blurs your vision, into something cooler and much more useful. By the time the bedroom lightened toward dawn, I had made a decision that was quieter and more final than anything I'd decided before. I was not going to react. I was going to prepare. And when I was ready, when I had everything arranged the way I needed it to be, I would move. And it would be thorough. And it would be legal. And it would be mine. In the morning, after Daniel left, I called my sister Pam. Pam is 3 years older than me, has a law degree that she uses in family practice in Raleigh, and is one of approximately 4 people in the world I trust completely and without reservation. I sat on the back porch with my second cup of coffee and told her everything in one long, mostly controlled account: the spreadsheet, the secret account, the county recorder's office, the LLC, the deed, the Plaza Midwood property, the flowers, the budget speech, the word entanglement. She listened without a single interruption until I was completely done, and then she was quiet for a moment in the particular way that Pam goes quiet when she's assessing something serious, and then she said, "How much do you have documented?" I told her: photographs of his phone screen showing the account balance and full transaction history, my spreadsheet tracking the deposit discrepancies across 11 months, a printed copy of the deed from the recorder's office, and the Summit Grove LLC registration documents I'd pulled from the Secretary of State's website the night before. She said, "Did you photograph the deed?" I said yes, and I had a printed copy too. Another pause. "You're not overreacting," she said, and I felt something release in my chest at those words, not because I'd doubted myself exactly, but because hearing it from outside my own head made it more structurally real. "This is real and it's significant. Don't say a word to him and call Marcus Webb first thing tomorrow morning." She gave me his number, told me to say I was referred by her, and told me not to sign a single thing Daniel presented me related to finances until I'd spoken with Marcus. She also told me something she phrased in her careful lawyer's language that hit me like a fact I should have already known: if a marital estate has been depleted through one spouse's undisclosed financial activity during the marriage, that is marital waste, and it is absolutely relevant to equitable distribution under North Carolina law. I wrote it down on a notepad in small, precise handwriting and stared at the phrase for a long time after we hung up. Marital waste. What Daniel had done to our money, to our life, to me, it had a name, it had legal weight, and it had remedies. I called Marcus Webb's office first thing the next morning from the driveway, before I went back inside, and his assistant said he could see me Thursday at 2. I said I'd be there. The 2 days between that call and Thursday were some of the longest I've passed through, and I passed through them with a performance of normalcy that I am still somewhat awed by when I think about it: dinner made, conversations had, evenings shared, the complete domestic surface of a marriage maintained without a single visible crack, while underneath it I was preparing something that was going to change everything. Daniel was, as far as I could tell, completely at ease. He was affectionate, communicative, present, the version of himself he'd been in the early years, which I now understood as the version he deployed when he wanted something to go smoothly. He mentioned casually, twice, that we should start thinking about the logistics of the budget split. I said yes, you're right, let's figure it out. He seemed satisfied. He had absolutely no idea. Thursday came with a gray sky and traffic on South Tryon Street that made me 8 minutes late, and I took the elevator to the 14th floor with my folder of documents held against my chest and my pulse at a rate I was deliberately not thinking about. Marcus Webb was a compact, deliberate man in his early 50s with close-cropped silver hair and a specific quality of stillness that I associate with people who have trained themselves to think faster than they react. Surgeons have it, excellent editors have it, and very good family law attorneys apparently have it too. He shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from his desk, said, "Tell me what's happening," and picked up his pen with the same unhurried efficiency he'd presumably applied to 1,000 of these conversations. I laid out everything in the order I'd prepared it: the discrepancy pattern, the photographs of the account, the LLC, the deed, the timeline. He listened without expression, writing occasionally in a hand so small I couldn't read it from across the desk, and when I finished, he put his pen down and looked at me for a moment that I understood as assessment rather than sympathy. "How much do you currently have in accessible accounts solely in your name?" he asked. "Nothing. Everything has been joint," I said. "Retirement accounts, through my employer?" "Around 80,000. He nodded, made a note. "The Plaza Midwood property, you have the deed but no financing documents?" "Correct. Only the deed. My paralegal will pull the mortgage records. I need to know how it was financed and whether there are any additional encumbrances." He leaned back slightly in his chair, in the particular way of someone settling into an analysis rather than a conversation. "Here's what you have. You have documentation of what appears to be deliberate concealment of marital assets, a private account, a property purchased through an LLC using what is very likely marital income, conducted over a sustained period during the marriage. In North Carolina, marital property is divided equitably, not necessarily equally, and equitable distribution takes into account factors including marital misconduct. Financial misconduct, dissipation of marital assets, is absolutely among those factors, and what you've documented here is going to be relevant to how a judge looks at the distribution of the marital estate. He looked at me steadily, with no drama whatsoever. He proposed a budget split verbally. Did you agree to anything in writing? No. I said fine verbally. Nothing signed. Good. Don't sign anything he presents to you related to finances, accounts, or assets without showing it to me first. Not a form, not a modification, nothing. He looked at his notes. Keep the joint accounts exactly as they are, do not move money out, but screenshot balances weekly and send copies to my paralegal. He may attempt to move things once he becomes aware that you're aware. We want to be ahead of that. He asked a few more precise questions, wrote a few more small handwriting notes, and then said something I held on to for the rest of that day. The thing you've done by documenting this quietly and thoroughly before confronting him, that's significant. It's much harder to manage a situation like this once the other party knows you're looking. I drove home from that building with the windows down and the heat coming in, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I felt something that wasn't dread or controlled fury or sleepless calculation. I felt, cautiously and precisely, like someone who was going to be okay. In the weeks that followed, I moved with a patience that surprised even me. I opened a personal checking account at a bank we'd never used together, funded it from a savings account I'd had since before the marriage that Daniel had never been on, and set it up as a quiet landing pad for whatever came next. I transferred copies of every joint financial document I could access, 6 years of tax returns, investment statements, the mortgage, credit cards, everything, to an encrypted folder Marcus's office had set up for me, and I did this on my lunch breaks and on evenings when Daniel was working late, which I no longer assumed meant working. I also did something I'd been carefully not doing. I paid attention to where Daniel actually was on the evenings he said he was out, not obsessively but with the precise attention of someone who understands that information is a resource and that she needs all of it. He was, most of those evenings, somewhere I couldn't immediately confirm, which told me something about Plaza Midwood that I already suspected. I let it sit. 3 weeks after the visit to Marcus's office, on a Saturday afternoon when Daniel told me he was playing golf with colleagues, an activity I now read entirely differently than I once had, I drove to Plaza Midwood. I parked half a block from the address on the deed and sat in my car with the engine off and the windows cracked, looking at an ordinary house on an ordinary street in a neighborhood 4 miles from where I lived with my husband. It was a newer construction, clean lines, minimal landscaping, a dark gray front door that someone had chosen deliberately. The blinds were half open. As I watched, the front door opened and a woman came out. She was perhaps 30, with red gold hair pulled up in a loose knot, wearing a light blue dress and sunglasses, carrying a small white dog in one arm and her keys in the other, the whole picture of someone who lived in the house behind her as simply and completely as someone who belongs somewhere. She locked the door, put the dog in a copper-colored Acura parked at the curb, and drove away without looking in my direction. I watched the car disappear around the corner. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth 4 times, counting each one. Then I started my car and drove home and made dinner and said nothing. I called Pam that evening from the bathroom with the water running, because old habits of caution don't stop being useful just because the source of caution is already aware of the general outline. I told her what I'd seen. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "I'm calling Dana Carroll tonight. She's the investigator I told you about." 3 days later, Dana had a name, a file, and a report that was thorough in the way that the work of very competent people tends to be. The woman was Kristen Poole, 29, junior account manager at a commercial real estate firm, not Daniel's firm, but the same market, enough professional overlap that their meeting would have been entirely unremarkable to anyone who knew both of them. She had begun receiving mail at the Plaza Midwood address 14 months ago, the same month the deed was filed. Dana's report included photographs, dates, documented contact, and one additional piece of information that I had not requested and had not expected: cell phone records showing contact between Daniel's number and Kristen's going back 26 months. 26 months, which was 4 months before the secret account had been opened, which meant the account wasn't the beginning of the plan, it was the funding mechanism for a plan that had started earlier still. He had been conducting this with such meticulous parallelism to our actual life that I had never once had a concrete, undeniable reason to suspect it. He was, I found myself thinking with a distant and involuntary admiration, exceptionally good at running two things at once. I sent the file to Marcus Webb at 7 in the morning, and he responded within 40 minutes, "This changes the scope significantly. Call me at 9. I sat in my car in a Starbucks parking lot at 9 o'clock and Marcus told me that the property, in Kristen Poole's effective occupancy, purchased through an LLC funded with marital income, maintained on an ongoing basis using additional marital funds diverted through a payroll split, was going to be an extremely uncomfortable set of documents for Daniel's attorney to work with in discovery. He said, "This is no longer just about equitable distribution. A judge is going to hear that your husband used household income to finance a second life and then proposed splitting the joint budget 50-50 while sitting across from you in the kitchen of the house you bought together." He said this flatly, without editorializing, but even Marcus's particular brand of legal flatness couldn't entirely strip the weight from it. "How soon do you want to move?" he asked. I thought about the grocery store flowers in my vase. I thought about Tom Petty in the shower. I thought about Portugal. "I want to be ready before I move," I said. "There may be one more thing I need to check first." The one more thing was Renee. I'd had a feeling about Daniel's mother from nearly the beginning of my marriage, a low, persistent feeling that I could never justify with specifics and therefore never acted on, the kind of thing that sits below the level of articulable concern and just hums there, slightly wrong, slightly off the frequency of everything else. Renee was gracious and measured and distributed her warmth with the careful precision of someone who never spent more than she'd budgeted. She called monthly, sent birthday cards, asked appropriate questions about my work and listened to the answers. She had cried at our wedding, the kind of tears that looked genuine from a distance. But there were things. There was the way she sometimes said Daniel needs, when talking about her son's requirements in a marriage, never "you both need," never "what makes sense for your family." There was a remark she'd made at Christmas the previous year, just one remark, about hoping Daniel was keeping something for himself, and then the quick, smooth pivot to another subject when I'd glanced up, smooth enough to be practiced, fast enough to suggest she'd known she'd said more than she intended. I'd noted it at the time. I had not acted on the note. I knew now that this had been a mistake. I asked Marcus to have Dana look at the call records between Daniel and Renee around the key dates, the account opening, the LLC registration, the deed filing. Dana came back 4 days later. In the 2 weeks surrounding the opening of the secret account 22 months ago, there had been 11 calls between Daniel's cell and Renee's, the longest running 48 minutes. In the week after the Summit Grove LLC was registered with the state, there had been a 40-minute call between them, followed 2 days later by a wire transfer from Renee's personal account to Summit Grove Properties LLC in the amount of $20,000. $20,000, wired from a mother to her son's secret LLC, 4 months after he'd begun diverting marital income into a private account, for the purpose of purchasing a house in which a 29-year-old woman would be living while he came home to me and agreed about the grocery budget and said I worried too much. She knew. She had known, almost certainly, from before the account was even opened. She had funded it. She had sat across from me at Christmas dinner and asked about my work and sent birthday cards and cried at my wedding, and she had done all of it while holding this particular piece of knowledge like something she'd put in a pocket and decided never to take out. I sat with that information for a full day. Not because it broke me open, I was beyond that stage now, had been moving through something cooler and more deliberate for weeks. But because there is a particular quality to discovering that the betrayal is wider than you thought, that it includes people you'd never thought to include in your accounting, and that quality requires time to absorb before you can move through it and past it and into whatever comes next. The next morning I told Marcus I was ready. He filed the initial paperwork 2 days later. I was in a 10 o'clock meeting when Daniel started calling. He called at 11:20. Then 3 more times before noon. Then from an unknown number. Then came a text, "We need to talk now." Then, "I know you met with an attorney. I need you to call me." Then, at 1 o'clock, the one that told me exactly how unprepared he was for this, "I can explain everything." I had Marcus's paralegal send the formal reply redirecting all communication through counsel, and then I went back to my afternoon and did my work and drove home at 5:15. He was waiting in my kitchen chair. He'd gotten there by mid-afternoon. His car was in the driveway when the neighbor's dog set off its familiar alert bark as I pulled in, and he'd been sitting in the chair that faced the door, which was not his usual chair, a positioning choice I recognized as deliberate. The kitchen was the same as always, the afternoon light on the hardwood, the smell of old coffee, the flowers in the vase that had passed their peak and were beginning to lean toward the rim. He stood up when I came in, and his face had the expression of a man whose plan has been disrupted in ways he's still running calculations on, not quite panicked, but working fast behind the eyes, recalibrating. "You can't just lawyer up without talking to me first," he said. "I just did," I said. I set my bag on the counter and turned to face him, and I kept my voice the same throughout what came next, level, almost quiet, the voice of someone who has been angry for long enough that the anger has burned down to something more durable and considerably more dangerous than heat. "Whatever you think you found," he started. "Daniel." I said his name and he stopped. "I have your bank account statements. I have 22 months of transaction history. I have the deed to the Plaza Midwood property. I have the Summit Grove LLC registration. I have 26 months of phone records between you and Kristen Poole. And I have a wire transfer record showing your mother sent $20,000 to your LLC 4 months after you opened the account I wasn't supposed to know about." I let all of that sit in the kitchen between us for a full breath. My attorney finds it all professionally very interesting. The silence was absolute. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove ticked 4 times before he said anything. "Kristen and I," he started, and I felt the sentence coming, the explanation, the contextualization, the version of events that was supposed to make this understandable, and I didn't want it. "That's not the conversation we're having," I said. "I don't need you to explain Kristen to me. The conversation we're having is about marital assets that were systematically diverted over nearly 2 years without my knowledge. That's what my attorney is focused on. That's what a judge will be focused on." I looked at him steadily across the kitchen we'd shared. "You asked me to split the budget 50-50. I said fine. Do you remember that?" He nodded, barely. "I meant it in a way you didn't understand yet." He sat back down slowly, and the practiced reasonableness was entirely gone from his face, and what was underneath it was something I hadn't expected, not monstrous, just human and cornered and considerably less calculated than the plan he'd built had required him to be. He put his hands on the table and looked at them. He said, "I was going to tell you." I asked when, after the budget split, after he'd insulated enough in his own account, after Kristen had been in that house long enough that the property question got complicated. He didn't answer. He looked at the table. I looked at the flowers in the vase on the counter, drooping nicely now past their grocery store prime, and I thought, he bought those. He carried them in. He put them in my vase in my kitchen and poured my wine and sat across from me and performed the scene of a reasonable man making a reasonable proposal. "The flowers were a nice touch," I said, and he flinched, and I picked up my bag and went upstairs. The 4 months of discovery that followed were not quick, and I'm not going to pretend they were clean, because they weren't, because these processes never are, because taking apart a life that 2 people built together is difficult work even when one of those people has behaved appallingly and deserves every difficult moment of it. Daniel's attorney, a competent and expensive man named Philip Garrett, spent the first 8 weeks arguing that Summit Grove Properties LLC was a separate investment vehicle predating the marriage. This failed when Marcus produced the LLC registration date, the account opening date, and 11 months of documented payroll diversions that demonstrated, with the clean persuasive clarity of a well-maintained spreadsheet, that the entire structure had been assembled during the marriage using marital income. Philip then argued that Renee's $20,000 was a personal loan, not a contribution to marital assets. Marcus asked for documentation of the loan terms, the agreement, the interest rate, the repayment schedule, the anything. There was no documentation of any loan terms, because the money had not been a loan, and everyone in the room knew it. The $20,000 became part of the marital estate calculation. The deposition happened in a conference room on the 22nd floor of a building uptown, in February, on a gray morning that felt like weather in keeping with the occasion. Daniel came in with Philip on his left and a look of contained wariness that he'd refined over 4 months of legal process, better than the night in the kitchen, more polished, the mask rebuilt and fitted more carefully. He did not look at me when he sat down. Marcus went through the documentation methodically and without expression, asking about the account, the deposits, the property, the LLC, the phone records, the funds from Renee, each one in precise, unhurried sequence. Daniel gave the answers Philip had prepared him for, careful, technical, avoiding without quite lying, the particular choreography of deposition testimony from someone who has been well coached. When Marcus asked about the purpose of the Plaza Midwood property, Daniel said it was a real estate investment. Marcus asked if Kristen Poole was living in the property. Daniel said yes, she was renting it. Marcus asked for the lease terms. Daniel said he'd need to check his records, which meant there were no lease terms, which everyone at the table understood. Marcus asked whether Daniel had disclosed the property to his wife at any point during the marriage. There was a pause. Philip started to say something and Daniel put up one hand, a quiet and decided gesture, the gesture of a man who has decided to answer himself. No, he said. The account receiving the diverted payroll deposits, was your wife made aware of that account's existence at any time? No, Daniel said, more quietly. During the same period in which funds were being diverted to this account and used to fund the Plaza Midwood property, you and your wife were operating a joint household budget that she managed. Is that correct? Yes. And during that period, your wife expressed concerns about household finances on at least one occasion that you're aware of? Philip started again and Daniel said, yes. The court reporter kept typing with the same steady neutrality she'd maintained throughout, and Philip wrote something on his notepad with a pressure that suggested he would have preferred different answers, and I sat on my side of the conference table and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction. Satisfaction is too warm a word for what it was, but was close to it. The structural thing of having it said out loud, on the record, by him. Marcus looked at his notes, then looked at Daniel with the same flat patience he brought to everything. Mr. Alcott, he said, you proposed to your wife that the household budget be split 50-50 in July of last year. Yes. At the time you made that proposal, you were in possession of $47,000 in a private account your wife did not know about, a property funded with marital income in which another person was residing, and an ongoing relationship with that person conducted entirely outside your wife's knowledge. Is that an accurate characterization of your situation at the time of the budget proposal? The pause was long enough that the court reporter stopped typing and waited with her fingers above the keys. Largely, Daniel said. His voice had been stripped of everything that usually inhabited it, the reasonableness, the warmth, the practiced lean of a man who listens well. There was just the word, plain and sufficient and damning. Marcus nodded once. Thank you, he said, and moved to the next section. The settlement conference was 6 weeks after the deposition, 7 hours long, and conducted in the kind of fluorescent-lit conference room that seems specifically designed to make everything feel final and transactional in equal measure. By the end of that day, the division of the marital estate, which included the sale value of our house on Selwyn, the retirement accounts, the secret account balance, and the assessed value of the Summit Grove property that a judge had agreed was marital property funded with marital income, had been calculated and divided in a way that incorporated the court's consideration of what North Carolina recognizes as dissipation of marital assets. I walked out of that building in the early evening with 55% of the total marital estate, the right to stay in the house through the end of the sale timeline, and a legal cost arrangement that reflected the fact that the litigation had been made necessary by Daniel's choices. He kept his car and his golf clubs and his relationship with his mother and his relationship with Kristen, for whatever any of those things were worth to him now on the far side of what he'd done to get them. He walked out of the conference room looking like a man who had run a long race and finished significantly behind where he'd planned to finish, which is the most precise description I have. Renee called 3 weeks after the settlement finalized. She called from her regular number, still in my contacts as Daniel's mom, and I stood in my kitchen holding the phone through 2 full rings and looking at those words before I answered. Her voice had the same measured warmth as always, but with something worn through it now, a threadbare quality underneath the performance that she'd never let me hear before. She said she wanted to talk. She said what Daniel did was wrong. She said she had known about some of it and she should have told me. She started to say something else and I said her name, quietly, the same way I'd said Daniel's name in this same kitchen 7 months earlier. I appreciate you calling, I said. I don't think there's anything either of us needs to say to each other. A pause on her end. Then, I hope you're well, Meredith. And I thought she meant it, in the way that people mean things that come too late and accomplish nothing except to close a door more gently than it deserved. Thank you, I said. And I hung up. The house on Selwyn sold in April, 4 weeks ahead of the realtor's projection, to a young couple from Virginia who walked through it on a Sunday afternoon and made an offer before the week was out. I wasn't there for the showing, but the realtor told me the woman had stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the windows, and had said something about the light. I moved into an apartment in Noda the following month, smaller, newer, no creaking floors, a kitchen with morning light coming from a completely different direction than the one I'd loved, which I found was entirely fine. Different is not the same as worse. Different has its own quality and its own particular morning light. Greta mentioned to me in passing, sometime in late spring, that Daniel's big commercial development project had collapsed, the developer had pulled funding in the fall, the whole thing had dissolved, and the commission Daniel had been counting on had evaporated with it. She mentioned this as industry news, without knowing it was relevant to me, and I said that was too bad and we moved on to something else. I held the information lightly, without particular feeling, the way you hold news about a place you used to live. Pam came to visit in May, the first properly warm weekend of spring, and we sat on my small balcony with wine and the kind of conversation that only works between people who have known each other long enough to skip the social layer and go directly to the thing underneath. She looked around at my apartment, the books finally arranged the way I'd always wanted them, the print I'd bought at a gallery in March on impulse and loved, the coffee set up on the counter that was just mine and optimized entirely for my preferences, and said, "You look like yourself." I thought about that. I think I was being someone else for a while, I said. I know, she said, and there was something in the simplicity of that, just I know, no elaboration, no analysis, that was more comforting than a long conversation would have been. You got quieter, she said. You're louder now. I laughed, which surprised me slightly, not the laugh itself but the ease of it, the way it came without effort. I think I'm just more here, I said, and that was exactly what I meant. On the last Sunday morning of May, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee, a different brand than I'd been buying for years, something a neighbor had recommended, which turned out to be better, and I opened my accounts. Just mine. All of them, and all of them real and accurate and exactly what they said, with no parallel structure underneath redirecting any of it somewhere else. The Sunday sit-down, that habit I'd maintained through 6 years of not knowing what I didn't know, felt entirely different now, not because the act had changed, but because every number I was looking at was a number that meant exactly what it said. No diversions. No LLC. No 26 months of something running quietly underneath everything I thought was real. I looked at the numbers for a long time, not because they required it but because I wanted to, because I could, because this was mine. I pulled up a new tab and typed in Portugal flights October. They were not unreasonable. Lisbon in October, when the crowds had thinned and the light had changed to that particular amber people traveled from everywhere to see. I'd read about it years ago and filed it away under Someday and watched Someday kept getting deferred by a budget I managed but didn't, as it turned out, fully control. There was no not yet anymore. There was just October and the question of when I wanted to go and whether I wanted the coastal route first or the city. I looked at it for a while. I bookmarked the flights. I closed the tab and refilled my coffee and sat with the quiet Sunday morning spread out around me like something that belonged entirely to me, which it did. The keys to the apartment were on the counter, on a ring I'd chosen myself, just a plain silver ring, nothing significant, but mine and only mine. Outside my window the May morning was doing something generous with the light, the way late spring mornings do before the heat arrives and changes everything. I picked up my coffee mug. It was still warm in exactly the right way. I took a sip, and it tasted the way it had tasted the first time I'd bought this brand, on impulse, because I'd wanted to try something different and there was no one's preference to consult but my own. Exactly that good. Exactly that simple. Exactly that mine.